Good night, and welcome to Quiet Victorian Nights. Before we begin, allow the day to loosen its hold upon you. Settle comfortably, let your shoulders soften, and take one slow, easy breath. Nothing more needs to be finished tonight. Any thought that remains may wait until morning. For now, you need only listen for as long as listening feels comfortable. Our story takes us to Alderwick, a quiet English village in the closing years of the 19th century. Autumn rain has darkened the roofs, fallen leaves rest beneath the chestnut trees, and a narrow stream passes beneath an old stone bridge. Near the common stands a modest cottage with a green gate. A little smoke rises from its chimney, and behind one softly lit window, an elderly bookbinder is completing the final task of his day while an old dog sleeps beside the stove. Nothing in Alderwick needs to be hurried, so let the present grow distant, let the village gather quietly around you, and follow the narrow path towards the green gate where our story begins. On the third morning of October 1893, a little before 7 o'clock, William Ashby was kneeling beside the kitchen range in his cottage at Alderwick, waiting for the fire to take hold. Rain had passed over the town during the night. It remained upon the green garden gate, along the narrow stone path, and beneath the pear tree, where the fallen leaves lay dark against the earth. Beyond the windows, the roofs of the neighboring cottages shone faintly under a pale sky. Smoke had begun to rise from the first chimneys, though the morning mist held it low above the lane. William placed another piece of kindling beneath the coal. The flame brightened, touched the blackened edge of the grate, and settled into a steady glow. He remained there for a moment, warming his hands before standing with one hand upon his knee. At 71, he had grown accustomed to moving slowly. He was a tall, spare man, with white hair brushed neatly back from his forehead, and a face made thoughtful by age rather than severe. His shoulders had narrowed, and the joints of his fingers were slightly bent, but his hands still retained the patience and accuracy developed through more than 50 years of bookbinding. Bess watched him from the rug beside the range. She was an elderly brown dog with long ears, a graying muzzle, and untidy fur around her paws. She had learned the order of William's mornings and rarely left the rug before he placed the kettle upon the stove. Only then did she raise her head, stretch one front leg, and wait for breakfast. William filled the kettle at the pump in the yard. The air smelled of wet stone, damp leaves, and distant chimney smoke. Somewhere beyond the wall, a cart moved slowly along the lane, its wheels softened by the wet ground. From the direction of the market street came the faint sound of shutters being lifted from the front of the baker's shop. The town was waking in its usual way. William returned to the kitchen, set the kettle over the fire, and cut 2 slices from the loaf he had bought the previous afternoon. He toasted them upon a long brass fork, spread them with a little butter, and prepared Bess's bowl. When the church clock struck 7, he was seated at the kitchen table with his tea, while Bess ate beside the range. His days usually began in this manner. There was comfort in knowing where the teapot stood, how long the fire required, and at what hour the first cart would pass the green gate. William did not consider routine a burden. It gave a quiet shape to hours that might otherwise have seemed too large. He had lived in Alderwick for 2 years. Before that, almost the whole of his adult life had been spent in Bristol, where he had worked as a bookbinder from the age of 16. He had begun as an apprentice in a narrow shop filled with leather, paper, thread, and paste. In time, the business had become his own, and for many years he and his wife had lived in the rooms above it. Margaret had died 4 years earlier. After her death, William continued opening the shop each morning. He raised the blind, swept the front step, and arranged the day's work upon the bench. Nothing in the shop had altered, yet the rooms above it seemed strangely changed. Margaret's chair remained by the window. Her teacup remained upon its shelf, but without the sound of her footsteps or the quiet movement of her hands, each object appeared to occupy more space than it had before. Their children had grown and established homes of their own. They wrote to William, visited when distance and family duties allowed, and had each offered him a room. He was grateful for their concern, but he did not wish to become a permanent guest in one of their households. He preferred a small life that remained his own. When he retired and sold the shop, he chose Alderwick because it was quiet without being isolated. The town was small enough to cross on foot, yet the railway made it possible for him to visit his children. There was a church, a baker, several modest shops, and a common crossed by a stream. Beyond the common, a low stone bridge joined the centre of the town to a scattering of cottages on the eastern side. William's house stood near the green, behind a low wall and a painted gate. It contained only the rooms he needed. A kitchen faced the back garden, a seldom used parlour looked towards the lane, and 2 bedrooms stood above them. Behind the house was an old wash house that William had converted into a workshop. After breakfast, he washed his cup, brushed the crumbs from the table, and put on his brown wool coat. Bess was already waiting by the door. Their morning walk followed the same familiar route. They passed beneath the chestnut trees at the edge of the common, where the first yellow leaves had fallen upon the wet grass. They continued beside the green, crossed a narrow lane, and returned along the churchyard wall. Bess walked without hurry, stopping whenever a hedge or gatepost required her attention. William waited without complaint. Alderwick was quiet at that hour. A few lamps still burned behind upper windows. The baker's boy carried a covered basket towards the market street, and a farmer's cart passed with vegetables piled beneath a wet cloth. Near the church, rooks moved among the high branches of an elm. The people they encountered greeted William by name. He was not an old resident of Alderwick, but his manner and his work had gradually made him familiar. The vicar sometimes brought him a prayer book with loose pages. Neighbours came with family Bibles, school books, or small volumes whose covers had worn thin. William accepted only as much work as his eyes and fingers could manage, and he completed it without haste. The workshop behind the cottage was the part of his new home he valued most. Its walls were whitewashed, its floor laid with old brick, and its single window looked over the rosemary growing beside the garden wall. William had placed his bench where the morning light fell across it. His sewing frame, wooden press and hand tools had travelled with him from Bristol. Their handles were darkened by years of use, and each rested in the place his hand expected to find it. Bess had her own place beneath the bench. After their walk, she settled there while William began the day's work. That morning, he was repairing a prayer book belonging to the vicar. The black leather had separated near the spine, and several folded sections had loosened from their thread. William examined the damage before selecting a needle. He had always believed that a worn book revealed the manner in which it had been loved. A softened corner showed where a thumb had rested. A loosened page marked a passage returned to many times. His purpose was not to remove every sign of age. It was simply to give the book enough strength to continue being used. For several hours, the workshop held only the quiet sounds of his labor. Thread passing through paper, the careful movement of a knife, and the occasional creak of the wooden press. Bess slept beneath the bench, her nose resting upon one paw. At midday, William returned to the kitchen and ate bread with a piece of cheese. He placed a small portion in Bess's bowl and opened the back door to let in the mild autumn air. Weak sunlight had appeared above the roofs. Water still shone upon the rosemary, and the pear tree released a single leaf that turned slowly before reaching the path. William considered his life comfortable. He had enough money for his modest needs, coal in the shed and food in the cupboard. His children cared for him. His neighbors knew him. There was useful work for his hands and a dog who expected him to return at the end of every walk. He did not think himself unhappy, yet there remained an emptiness within the order of his days, most noticeable after nightfall. Once supper had been eaten and the dishes put away, the house seemed to enlarge around its silence. William would sit beside the range with a book upon his knee, though his eyes now tired after only a few pages. When he lowered the book, he heard the coal shifting in the grate, the wind beneath the door, and the measured ticking of the clock. Margaret's photograph stood upon the mantel in a narrow oval frame. Some evenings, William spoke to it. He might mention a letter received from one of the children or a book brought to the workshop. He might say that the weather had turned colder or that Bess had refused her breakfast until he added a little gravy. These were not conversations in the ordinary sense. He did not expect an answer. Speaking simply gave the small events of the day somewhere to rest before he extinguished the lamp. Bess made the silence easier. She had come to William not long after he moved to Alderwick. Until then, she had belonged to an elderly widow who lived beyond the common. William had often seen them walking together, the woman taking careful steps while the dog adjusted her pace to remain beside her. When the widow died, Bess stayed briefly with one of the relatives who came to settle the house. Several days later, on a wet afternoon, William found the dog sitting outside his green gate. Rain had darkened her coat, but she waited without scratching or barking. She merely looked through the wooden bars, as if she had reached the place she had intended to find. William led her into the kitchen until the rain passed. She lay beside the range through the afternoon and showed no desire to leave when evening came. He folded an old blanket for her near the stove. The next morning, he bought another bowl. No formal decision had been necessary. Bess had chosen the cottage, and William had made room for her. From then on, their lives settled quietly together. Bess accompanied him across the common, slept beneath the workbench, and lay near his chair in the evening. She required little beyond food, warmth, and the freedom to stop wherever an interesting scent crossed their path. William, in return, asked only for her company. That October evening, rain began again after supper. It touched the windows softly, while William sat beside the range, with the repaired prayer book resting closed upon his lap. Bess slept near his feet. The kitchen smelled of coal, damp wool, and the faint trace of paste carried in from the workshop. Without warning, the familiar smell drew William back to Elmswell, the village where he had grown up. The memory came in fragments. He saw a shallow stream called Miller's Beck moving beneath summer trees. A wooden bridge crossed the water, its boards pale and dry in the sunlight. Beyond it stood the dark shape of old Turner's barn, where two boys had once hidden from an afternoon shower. William remembered fishing lines stretched over the stream. He remembered a large elm near the bank, and the place beneath its roots, where the boys had hidden their fishing rods so that no adult would find them. Another boy stood beside him in the memory. His name would not come, nor could William clearly see his face. He recalled only a thin pair of knees beneath rolled trousers, a hand reaching for the fishing line, and laughter carried across the water. William did not force the recollection. He had learned that old memories often faded when pursued too closely. Bess stirred and moved her head onto the toe of his boot. William rested one hand upon her graying fur. Outside, rain fell from the eaves into the water barrel. The fire lowered, and the kitchen grew still around them. Slowly, the wooden bridge, the old barn, and the indistinct figure of the second boy withdrew once more into the quiet distance of William's past. The change in Bess's habits began so quietly that William noticed it only after it had occurred several times. A few mornings after the rain, they were crossing the eastern side of the common when Bess stopped at the point where their usual path curved back towards the churchyard. Another path continued between the chestnut trees and descended towards the old stone bridge over Miller's Beck. Beyond the bridge, the ground rose towards a small group of cottages, partly hidden by hedges and autumn trees. Bess stood with one front paw raised, looking down the path. William waited. Nothing unusual could be seen near the bridge. The stream moved beneath its low arch, and a few yellow leaves drifted upon the water. Smoke rose from a chimney on the opposite bank. Otherwise, the path was empty. "This way, Bess," William said. She glanced at him, but did not move. Her graying nose lifted slightly, as though she had caught a distant scent. Only when William tapped his walking stick against the ground did she turn and follow him towards the churchyard. Even then, she looked back once before the trees concealed the bridge. The following morning, she stopped at the same place. This time, she walked several yards down the descending path before William called her. On the third morning, she went as far as the first chestnut tree and remained there, listening or smelling something beyond William's understanding. He assumed that another animal had crossed the bridge during the night. Bess had never shown much interest in foxes or rabbits, but even an old dog might occasionally discover a new curiosity. William therefore thought little of it until, one morning, she asked to leave the cottage for a second time. They had already completed their usual walk. William had eaten his breakfast, cleared the table, and opened the workshop. Bess had settled beneath the bench while he arranged the prayer book and his tools. A few minutes later, however, she rose and returned to the kitchen. William heard her touch the wooden latch with her nose. When he looked through the doorway, She was waiting beside the back door. "You have only just come home," he reminded her. Bess touched the latch again. The morning was dry, and the green gate stood closed at the end of the yard. Bess had never wandered far without him, nor did she possess the speed required to cause much trouble. William placed his needle upon the bench and opened the door. She crossed the yard immediately. After he unlatched the gate, she passed into the lane and continued towards the common without looking back. Her pace was slow but certain. Beneath the chestnut trees, she took the eastern path and disappeared towards the bridge. William remained at the gate for a little while. Then he returned to his work. Bess came home less than half an hour later. Her paws were damp, though the grass near the cottage had already begun to dry. She drank from her bowl, entered the workshop, and curled beneath the bench as if nothing unusual had happened. The next morning, she went again. Soon the solitary journeys became part of her routine. After breakfast, she waited beside the door until William let her out. She always crossed the common in the same direction and always returned by way of the stone bridge. At first, she was absent for 20 minutes. Before long, half an hour passed before William heard the green gate move against the path. He began to notice small traces of the places she had visited. Dark mud remained between her toes on a morning when the roads were dry. A pale crumb of bread clung to the fur beneath her collar. On another day, the warm smell of wood smoke followed her into the kitchen, different from the coal smoke rising from William's range. Then, one morning, he detected the unmistakable scent of ham around her muzzle. Bess watched quietly while he examined her whiskers. "You are being fed," he said. Her tail moved once across the floor. William understood that she was not merely exploring the bank of the stream. Somewhere beyond the bridge, Bess had found a house where she was welcomed. Someone had given her bread and meat and allowed her near a wood fire. The discovery amused him more than it worried him. Bess always returned before midday and appeared content after every visit. Whoever received her was plainly treating her kindly. Still, William wondered where she went. From the edge of the common, he could see only a few houses on the opposite side of the bridge. Some faced the stream, while others stood farther back behind stone walls and gardens. Smoke rose from several chimneys each morning. Any one of those houses might contain the person who now expected Bess at the door. William considered following her, but each day he postponed it. Bess's journeys seemed to belong to her. She had once chosen his green gate without assistance, and perhaps she had now found another quiet household in need of her company. As long as she returned safely, he saw no reason to interfere. Yet the cottage felt altered while she was away. When William entered the workshop, he still expected to find her beneath the bench. He sometimes lowered one hand with a crust of bread before remembering that she was not there. The silence had been present before Bess came to live with him, but during the past 2 years, he had forgotten its exact shape. Without her breathing beneath the table or shifting upon the rug, the rooms seemed less settled. He tried to attend to his work. Thread passed through folded paper. The knife moved carefully along the edge of a new leather hinge, and the wooden press creaked as he tightened it. Even so, part of his attention remained upon the lane. Bess always came back. Sometimes her paws were wet from the stream. Sometimes a dry leaf clung to her coat. Once William found a narrow rosemary leaf caught beside the buckle of her collar. Nearly every morning, she carried home the faint smell of another hearth. Near the middle of October, fine rain began before dawn. It covered the windows and darkened the garden wall. Water gathered along the branches of the pear tree, while the common beyond the lane disappeared behind a grey veil. William assumed that Bess would remain indoors. They did not take their usual walk. After breakfast, William opened the workshop and began sorting several loose pages from a child's storybook. Bess followed him, but did not lie down. She stood for a moment beside the bench, then returned to the kitchen. A soft sound came from the back door. "No!" William called. "Not today." Bess remained beside the latch. The rain continued steadily. William returned to the book and placed the pages in their proper order. Before he had finished, Bess touched the latch again and gave a low, patient sound. William looked at her through the open doorway. There was no restlessness in her manner. She simply waited, as though someone beyond the common might also be waiting, and ought not to be disappointed, merely because the morning was wet. "You will be soaked before you reach the bridge." Her tail moved once. William fetched an old cloth and left it beside the range for her return. Then he opened the door. Bess went out without hesitation. She crossed the wet yard, passed through the green gate, and disappeared into the rain. William attempted to resume his work. The storybook required a new cloth spine, but he measured the material twice without cutting it. Rain tapped upon the workshop roof and ran from the eaves into the water barrel. Every few minutes, he looked through the small window towards the gate. Half an hour passed. Then the church clock marked the next quarter. Bess had never remained away so long in poor weather. William carried his tea into the workshop, but left it untouched upon the bench. He told himself that the dog had found shelter. The traces of wood smoke and food proved that she was entering a house rather than remaining beside the stream. There was no reason to imagine that the morning was different from any other. Even so, he listened for her. Nearly an hour after she had left, the green gate scraped softly against the path. William went to the kitchen door. Bess was crossing the yard with rain darkening her entire coat. Mud covered her paws and lower legs, and several wet leaves clung to the fur along her side. A small twig had caught near one shoulder, yet she appeared entirely satisfied. Her head was raised, and her tail struck the door while William dried her with the waiting cloth. She stood patiently as he rubbed the mud from her legs and removed the leaves one by one. Beneath the smells of rain and wet earth, he found wood smoke, toasted bread, and another faint trace of ham. Bess had not endured the journey unwillingly. She had gone because she wished to be somewhere, and she had returned happier for having reached it. William spread the cloth beside the range. Bess turned twice upon it, lowered herself with a long sigh, and closed her eyes. Within minutes, she was asleep. He sat at the kitchen table and watched her. It seemed clear now that food alone did not draw her across the common. Bess had found someone whose presence pleased her, someone who opened a door even on a wet morning and allowed an old dog to rest beside the fire. Perhaps a hand waited each day to touch her graying head. Perhaps another quiet room felt less empty when she entered it. That evening, William told Margaret's photograph that Bess appeared to have made a private acquaintance beyond the bridge. Then he looked down at the dog sleeping beside his chair. "Tomorrow morning," he said quietly, "I shall go with you." The rain had ended before dawn. By the time William entered the kitchen, a pale October light had begun to gather beyond the windows, revealing a garden washed clean by the previous morning's weather. Thin mist lay over the common, and drops of water still hung from the pear branches and the top of the green gate. William followed his ordinary routine with particular care. He lit the range, filled the kettle, and washed Bess's bowl beneath the pump. He toasted 2 slices of bread, spread them with butter, and drank his tea while the church clock prepared to strike 7. Nothing in his movements suggested that the morning would be different from any other. Bess ate beside the range. When her bowl was empty, she drank a little water and returned to the rug. She appeared to have forgotten the conversation of the previous evening. William cleared the table, washed his cup, and carried his tools into the workshop. He opened the shutters, placed the children's storybook beneath the window, and arranged the measured strip of cloth beside it. Bess followed him as usual and stood for a moment near the workbench. Then she turned towards the kitchen. William heard her nose touch the latch. He waited until she repeated the sound before entering the house. Bess stood beside the back door with the same patient expression she had worn on every morning of her private journeys. William opened it without comment. She crossed the yard and waited at the green gate. He unlatched it, watched her enter the lane, and allowed her to continue until she had nearly reached the chestnut trees. Only then did he return for his coat. He slipped one arm and then the other into the worn brown wool, placed his soft felt hat upon his head, and took the walking stick from beside the door. By the time he stepped through the gate, Bess had disappeared behind the first line of trees. William did not hurry. Bess was old and unlikely to travel quickly, while his own knees objected to any sudden demand upon them. He followed the damp lane towards the common, keeping his pace quiet and even. The mist had begun to lift from the grass. Beneath the chestnuts, last night's rain had collected in the fallen leaves, making them lie flat and dark upon the path. Drops remained along the lower branches and fell occasionally with a soft tapping sound. Ahead, William caught sight of Bess's brown back moving between the trees. She did not look behind her. At the place where their usual route curved towards the churchyard wall, Bess continued straight across the common. The wet grass brushed against her legs. William remained upon the firmer edge of the path, using his stick where the earth had softened. Alderwick was waking behind him. The church clock struck the quarter hour, and a cart entered the market street with the muted rattle of wheels over damp stones. Somewhere near the baker's shop, a door opened and closed. The sounds reached William faintly through the mist, then faded as he moved farther from the center of town. Bess followed the descending path towards the stone bridge. The stream below it had risen slightly after the rain. Water moved beneath the low arch with a quiet, steady sound, carrying yellow leaves away from the common. Early sunlight passed through the thinning branches and rested briefly upon the wet stones at the edge of the bank. Bess crossed without pausing. William reached the bridge a short time later. From its center, he could see her climbing the path on the opposite side. She moved with more purpose than she showed during their ordinary walks. Although her pace remained slow, she did not stop to inspect the hedges or the wooden posts beside the road. For a moment, William wondered whether she knew he was behind her. If she did, she gave no sign. Beyond the bridge, the path entered a part of Alderwick he rarely visited. The cottages there stood farther apart than those near the market street. Most were small stone houses with low walls, narrow windows, and gardens sloping gently towards the stream. A few late roses remained beneath the windows, their petals bowed by rain. Apples lay among the wet grass beneath an old tree, and smoke from several chimneys drifted low across the roofs. The air smelled of damp earth, leaves, and newly lit wood fires. Bess passed the first 2 cottages. At the third, she slowed but did not stop. She continued beyond a narrow lane and approached a house partly concealed behind an overgrown hawthorn hedge. The garden gate was low and made of weathered wood. Its paint had once been white, though wind and rain had reduced much of it to a thin grey surface. Bess walked directly towards it. William stopped some distance away, beside the hedge. Bess placed her nose between the bars. Her tail began to move. After a moment, she pushed against the gate, which had been left resting loosely upon its latch. It opened just far enough for her to pass through. She entered the garden with complete confidence. William remained where he was. The cottage appeared to have been occupied only recently. It was sound and well kept, but the garden showed signs of unfinished attention. Fallen leaves had been gathered into several uneven piles beside the path. 2 shrubs near the front window had been cut back, though one remained noticeably higher than the other. Wooden crates stood beneath the eaves, and a spade leaned against the wall with dark soil still clinging to its blade. Near the steps lay a pair of gardening gloves, a small hand fork, and a coil of twine that had not yet been put away. One shutter stood open, while the other remained fastened against the stone. Several objects visible through the front window were still covered with cloth. William understood that whoever lived there had not been settled for long. Bess followed the garden path towards a small covered porch. A wooden chair had been placed there to catch the morning light. Beside it stood a low table holding a teapot, a single cup, and a folded cloth. A newspaper rested open across the knees of the man seated in the chair. He appeared to be near William's own age. His hair was white and cut short around the ears, and his body had the narrow, slightly stooped appearance of someone accustomed to spending long hours upon his feet. He wore a dark waistcoat beneath a brown jacket. A pair of spectacles rested low upon his nose. At the sound of Bess's paws upon the path, he lowered the newspaper. His face changed at once. The quiet, inward expression with which he had been reading softened into recognition. He folded the paper, placed it upon the table, and leaned forward as Bess climbed the shallow step. The dog pressed her head beneath his waiting hand. He stroked her ears and the graying fur along her neck with the ease of a familiar ritual. Bess's tail moved slowly across the porch boards. When the man withdrew his hand, she settled beside his chair as though she had occupied that place every morning for years. William watched from beyond the gate. There was the wood smoke he had noticed in her coat, rising from the cottage chimney. The remains of toast lay upon a small plate beside the teapot. A pale woolen blanket had been folded over the second chair, and rosemary grew beneath the porch window. Every trace Bess had carried home now had its place. The man reached towards the plate, broke off a corner of toast, and held it down. Bess accepted it gently before resting her chin against his knee. Only then did he look towards the garden path. His eyes passed over the open gate and came to rest upon William standing outside it, one hand upon his walking stick. For several quiet seconds, neither man moved. Part Eve. Tea in the cottage. The man was the first to move. He removed his spectacles and folded them into the breast pocket of his waistcoat. Then he rose from the chair, one hand resting briefly upon its wooden arm. Bess remained beside him, her chin raised beneath his fingers, as though William's appearance required no explanation from her. William opened the garden gate. "I hope she has not been troubling you," he said. "I had not known where she was going." The man looked down at Bess. A quiet amusement passed across his face. "She has caused no trouble at all. She has been coming every morning for several weeks." William glanced at the empty plate beside the teapot. "I had begun to suspect as much." Bess left the porch and came partway down the path to greet him. She touched her nose to the side of his coat, then turned back towards the cottage before he could reach for her collar. Her manner suggested that the two men were being unnecessarily slow. The stranger watched her return. "I have been calling her the old lady," he said. "She did not arrive with a name, and I did not know whom she belonged to. Her name is Bess." "Bess," the man repeated, as though testing the sound against the dog he had come to know. "Yes, that seems right." He bent to stroke the fur behind her ears. Bess's tail moved once against the porch step. William explained that she had first crossed the common alone only a short time earlier. He mentioned the damp paws, the bread beneath her collar, and the smell of ham that had finally convinced him she was visiting a house. The stranger listened with mild embarrassment and admitted that the ham had been his doing. He had not intended to encourage her to wander, but after the first morning, she had returned with such certainty that he had begun saving a small piece from his breakfast. "She usually sits there," he said, indicating the space beside his chair. "On wet mornings, I let her inside." The cottage door stood open behind him. From within came the warmth of a wood fire and the faint ticking of a clock. Bess had already turned towards it. The man looked from the dog to William. "There is more tea in the pot. You might allow me to offer you a cup, if only to thank you for lending me her company without knowing it." William hesitated. His storybook remained upon the workshop bench, its new cloth spine measured but not yet attached. He had expected merely to discover where Bess went and then return home. Yet there was no reason for haste. The morning was still young, and the stranger's invitation contained neither insistence nor ceremony. He stepped onto the porch. Inside, the cottage was smaller than it had appeared from the garden. A narrow passage opened directly into a sitting room where a fire burned low in an iron grate. Several boxes remained against the walls, some closed and others half emptied. Books had been arranged upon 2 shelves, though spaces between them showed that the work was unfinished. A rolled carpet rested beside the stairs. The room nevertheless felt inhabited. A kettle stood near the hearth. A woolen blanket covered the back of a chair, and a small clock ticked upon the mantel. Near the window, a table had been positioned to receive the morning light. Bess crossed to the fire and settled upon a worn mat without waiting to be invited. The place was plainly familiar to her. The man brought the teapot inside and added another cup to the table. He poured carefully, offering William milk from a small jug. Their first conversation remained upon ordinary matters. They spoke of the previous day's rain, the dampness beside the stream, and the likelihood of colder weather before the month ended. The stranger explained that he had moved into the cottage only several weeks earlier. That accounted for the boxes, the uncovered furniture, and the uneven work in the garden. He had trimmed one side of the hawthorn hedge before the rain began, then discovered that the task required more strength than he remembered. William said that gardens often revealed their size only after one began attending to them. This seemed to please the man. He looked towards the window, where the wet branches moved faintly against the glass. For a little while, they discussed the garden. Rosemary grew beneath the porch, though it had been planted by the previous tenant. There were bulbs beneath the front bed, whose variety would remain unknown until spring. An apple tree stood behind the cottage, neglected but still bearing fruit. The stranger intended to clear the fallen apples once the ground had dried. Bess slept beside the hearth while the two men talked. Her slow breathing mingled with the ticking clock and the occasional settling of wood in the grate. The stranger had not lived in Alderwick long enough to know many people. William told him that he had arrived only 2 years earlier and still considered himself a recent inhabitant. He mentioned the bookbinding shop in Bristol, his retirement, and the small workshop behind his cottage where he continued to repair a few books. "You came here from Bristol then?" the man asked. William nodded. "Did you live there from childhood?" The question was asked casually. The stranger had lifted his cup and was watching the steam rise above it. "No," William said. "I was born in Elmswell." The cup stopped before reaching the man's lips. For the briefest moment, his expression did not change. Then his hand lowered very slowly. He placed the cup upon its saucer with unusual care, as though the slightest careless movement might disturb something that had begun to rise between them. Neither man spoke. Beside the fire, Bess continued to sleep. The little clock measured several quiet seconds, while a thin line of steam drifted upwards from the kettle and disappeared into the stillness of the room. The man kept his eyes upon William. "Elmswell," he repeated quietly. There was nothing remarkable in the name itself. It was a small village, and many people had been born there before leaving for larger towns. Yet the way he spoke it made William feel that the word had entered the room carrying something more than the name of a distant place. "You knew it?" William asked. The man did not answer at once. He leaned back slightly in his chair, though his hands remained close to the untouched cup upon the table. "Do you remember the wooden bridge over Miller's Beck?" William looked at him more carefully. "Yes, and the deeper water below it, near the bend." A memory stirred before William could prevent it. He saw sunlight moving across a narrow stream, and the dark green shadow beneath the trees. The bridge appeared as it had the previous evening, pale boards, a low rail, and summer grass growing high along the bank. "That was where I learned to swim," he said. The man's expression softened. William remembered the afternoon only in fragments. He had been 11, or perhaps 12. The water had seemed much deeper then than it could truly have been. He had stood upon the muddy bank with his shirt folded beneath the elm, delaying the moment when he must enter. Another boy was already in the stream, calling to him from beyond the reeds. William had insisted that the water was too cold. The boy had laughed and splashed him until remaining dry became impossible. "You did not learn willingly," the man said. William felt something shift quietly within him. "No," he replied. "Someone pushed me." The man lowered his gaze, and the beginning of a smile appeared at one corner of his mouth. "Only after you had stood there for half an hour, declaring that you would enter in another minute." The sitting room seemed to grow very still. The clock continued to tick upon the mantel, and a piece of wood settled softly in the grate. Bess raised her head from the mat, but did not rise. William searched the face opposite him. Age had altered it in all the ways age altered a face. The cheeks had become hollow, the brow more deeply marked, and the hair entirely white. Yet behind those changes, William began to see a boy standing knee-deep in Miller's beck, his wet hair lying across his forehead and his hands held out in reassurance after the foolish push had been made. William placed his cup upon the table. "There was an elm beside the stream," he said. "A very large one. We kept things beneath its roots. Fishing rods," the man replied. "2 of them, though yours was little more than a hazel branch with a length of line tied to the end." William almost smiled. "We thought no one knew they were there. Old Turner knew. He found us taking them out one morning and said nothing." The name brought another part of the village into view. William remembered Turner's shed beyond the wooden bridge, its roof patched with sheets of dark tin. In his recollection, it had been a barn, though perhaps childhood had enlarged it. He remembered sheltering there during a summer shower and listening to the rain strike the roof while 2 boys divided an apple with a pocket knife. "Turner's old shed," William murmured. "It leaned so badly that our mothers forbade us to go inside. We went in whenever it rained, and once when it did not." That had been the afternoon they had attempted to repair a broken wheelbarrow with string, 2 bent nails, and a piece of wood taken from the shed wall. The repair had lasted only until they tried to move it. William had forgotten the wheelbarrow completely, yet now he could see its single wheel turning slowly before falling sideways into the grass. The memory carried laughter with it, not the faint, indistinct laughter William had heard beside the fire the previous evening, but a particular laugh, quick at first, then interrupted by breath whenever the boy tried to speak. William heard it again as the man opposite him gave a quiet chuckle. The sound had aged less than the face. William leaned forward. "You are not Henry Tull, are you?" The man looked at him for several seconds. His eyes had grown bright behind the fine lines surrounding them. "William Ashby," he said. They both began to laugh. It was not loud laughter. Neither man possessed the breath for that now. It came uncertainly at first, carrying astonishment rather than amusement, then warmed as one looked at the other and found the recognition still there. Henry rose from his chair. William stood as well, using the edge of the table for support. They reached across the small space between them and clasped hands. The gesture began as an ordinary handshake, but neither released the other when formality required it. William felt the thinness of Henry's fingers and the firmness that remained in his grasp. More than 60 years lay between the 2 boys beside Miller's beck and the 2 old men standing in the quiet cottage. Yet for that moment, the distance seemed to have folded upon itself. Henry placed his free hand awkwardly upon William's shoulder. William returned the gesture with an equally uncertain pat upon Henry's arm. Neither was accustomed to displaying emotion openly, and neither attempted to explain what could not yet be put into words. At last, they sat again. The tea had begun to cool, but Henry poured a little more into each cup. William watched him replace the pot and found that familiar details continued to emerge. The slight tilt of his head while considering something, the careful way he pressed his lips together before speaking, and the habit of resting one thumb against the edge of the saucer. Bess left the hearth and came to lie between their chairs. She placed her head upon William's boot, while one side of her body rested against Henry's shoe, as though this arrangement had always been her intention. Henry looked down at her. Perhaps she recognized something before we did. William rested his hand upon Bess's graying head. Neither man dismissed the thought. For a little while, William and Henry remained seated without speaking. The astonishment of recognition had passed, but something quieter had taken its place. Each man continued to study the other in small, uncertain glances, as though the face before him might alter again if examined too directly. Age had covered the familiar features with lines, changed the shape of the cheeks, and whitened the hair, yet beneath those changes remained gestures neither had known he remembered. Henry still tilted his head slightly when listening. William still rubbed one thumb against the side of his forefinger when considering what to say. Such habits had survived more faithfully than either name or face. Between their chairs, Bess slept with her body touching both pairs of shoes. The tea cooled upon the table. Henry eventually lifted the pot, discovered that very little remained, and poured the last of it into their cups. The ordinary action seemed to settle the room. William leaned back, and the stiffness that had entered his shoulders began slowly to leave them. Their memories returned first to Elmswell. They spoke of Miller's Beck in summer, when the water ran shallow over pale stones and small fish gathered in the shadows beneath the bank. They remembered the wooden bridge, worn smooth at the center by boots, cartwheels, and generations of children who had dragged sticks along its rails. In spring, the stream sometimes rose high enough to touch the lowest boards. In August, it became so clear that they could see every pebble upon the bottom. Old Turner's barn stood beyond it, though Henry continued to call it a shed, and William insisted that it had been large enough to deserve the grander name. Neither could recall what Turner had stored there. They remembered only the smell of dry timber, the rain sounding upon the roof, and the narrow opening in the wall through which a thin blade of sunlight fell across the floor. They had hidden there many times when they ought to have been elsewhere. On one particular morning, they had left home carrying school books and had reached the school gate before deciding that the weather was far too fine to spend indoors. They had crossed the fields instead, collected their fishing rods from beneath the elm roots, and passed the entire day beside Miller's Beck. Their catch had consisted of one fish, scarcely longer than Henry's finger. William remembered wrapping it in a dock leaf. Henry remembered that William had insisted upon taking it home. Both remembered returning to the village after the school bell had rung and discovering their mothers waiting at opposite ends of the lane. Neither boy had been permitted near the stream for a week. "We went back on the 8th day," Henry said. "The 7th," William corrected. Henry considered this and nodded. You may be right. The recollection brought no regret. The punishment, once so important, had disappeared from memory, while the stream, the small fish, and the walk home beneath the evening light remained perfectly clear. One memory opened gently into another. They recalled collecting wind-fallen apples from the orchard behind the chapel and carrying them in their shirts. They remembered winter mornings when the wooden bridge was silver with frost and their breath hung before them as they walked to school. There had been a black and white dog belonging to the miller, a rook with a damaged wing that lived one season in Turner's barn, and a boat made from a broken washing tub that had sunk before either boy climbed into it. Nothing they remembered had been important enough to enter any written history, yet each small incident had remained somewhere within them, waiting for another person to provide the missing half. William would recall a place, but not the season. Henry supplied the month because the hawthorn had been flowering. Henry remembered an afternoon beside the beck, but had forgotten why William's sleeve was torn. William reminded him of the fence they had climbed while avoiding a bull that, in truth, had been grazing too far away to notice them. The village of their childhood gradually assembled itself in the room, the low cottages, the narrow schoolhouse, the chapel bell, Turner's leaning barn, and the path beside the water. It was not exactly the Elmswell that had existed. Time had softened its uncomfortable winters, its muddy lanes, and the long hours of work expected even from children. What returned was the smaller world they had shared within it, bounded by the stream, the fields, and the certainty that another morning would find them in the same place. Bess shifted in her sleep. One paw moved as though she too were traveling along an old path. After a while, their conversation reached the year William had left. He had been 16 when a place was found for him with a bookbinder in Bristol. The opportunity had seemed too valuable to refuse. His mother packed his shirts into a borrowed case, and his father accompanied him as far as the railway station. William had expected to return often. At 16, distance appeared to be a temporary inconvenience rather than something capable of changing the shape of a life. He and Henry had exchanged several letters during the first year. William wrote of the narrow shop, the smell of leather and paste, and the long hours spent folding paper under the eye of his master. Henry wrote of Elmswell, the stream, and familiar people whose lives had continued after the train carried William away. Then Henry's father found work elsewhere, and the Tull family left the village. A letter was sent to William from their new address. He answered it, but his reply was returned several weeks later because the family had moved again. Henry wrote once more to the bookbinding shop, though by then William's employer had transferred him to another set of rooms while repairs were made to the building. The letter did not reach him. There had been no disagreement, no final words, and no deliberate decision to let the friendship end. Their lives had simply moved beyond the reach of the addresses they possessed. For a few years, William occasionally asked after Henry when a letter arrived from Elmswell. No one seemed certain where the Tulls had settled. Later, work occupied more of his time. His apprenticeship ended, his responsibilities increased, and months began to pass with a speed he had not expected. Henry, meanwhile, had entered railway work. He began in a small engineering office where his first duties involved copying figures, carrying messages, and keeping drawings free from coal dust. Over the years, the work took him wherever lines were being surveyed, repaired, or extended. He spent months near towns he barely came to know, lodging in rooms above shops or in cottages close to the railway. When one assignment ended, another carried him farther away. He described no great adventures. He spoke instead of temporary desks, rolled plans, wet cuttings, iron bridges, and the endless measurements upon which safe journeys depended. There had been winters when the ground was too hard to work, and summers when heat shimmered above the rails. He learned to recognize the sound of an approaching locomotive long before it appeared, and to sleep through noises that kept other men awake. William listened with his hands resting upon the head of his walking stick. Whenever Henry mentioned a town he knew, he nodded, though their paths had never crossed. William's own life had remained largely in Bristol. He told Henry of completing his apprenticeship, saving what he could, and eventually taking over the bookbinding business. He spoke of the long workbench beneath the rear window and the rooms above the shop where he and Margaret had made their home. He mentioned Margaret quietly. He described her good sense, her habit of placing flowers in a small jar beside the kitchen window, and the way she could identify William's mood from the sound of his steps upon the stairs. They had raised their children above the shop, where the smell of leather and warm paste reached even the bedrooms on busy days. Henry asked how long she had been gone. 4 years, William said. No expression of sympathy was necessary. Henry asked how long she had been gone, then looked towards the fire. The pause contained more understanding than a carefully chosen sentence might have done. William explained that the children now had households of their own. They wrote regularly and had each offered him a place after Margaret's death. He could have lived surrounded by grandchildren, busy meals, and the constant movement of a larger family. Yet he had known that he would always feel like a visitor, however kindly received. He had sold the shop, left Bristol, and come to Alderwick. Henry's life had been different in its details, though it had also carried him towards retirement, with fewer companions than he had once expected. Railway work had trained him to live lightly in temporary houses. He had owned little that could not be packed into boxes, and even after his work became more settled, he had retained the habit of expecting another departure. When he retired, he remained for a time near his final posting. Nothing required him to stay, but no other place had made a stronger claim upon him. He read newspapers from towns along the railway, considered several small houses, and delayed his decision until the year was nearly over. Then he saw a notice concerning the cottage in Alderwick. He had arrived only several weeks before Bess began appearing at the garden gate. William looked around the room again. The closed boxes and rolled carpet no longer seemed merely signs of unfinished work. Henry had spent much of his life moving from one temporary place to another. Even now, with no railway company waiting to send him elsewhere, he had not fully unpacked. "What brought you here?" William asked. Henry considered the question. He had never visited Alderwick before taking the cottage. The notice had mentioned the railway connection, the market street, and the modest rent. Those things had made the place suitable, but they did not fully explain why he had chosen it over several others. On the afternoon he first came to view the cottage, he had walked from the station through the town. He passed the church, crossed the common, and reached the stone bridge as weak sunlight appeared beneath the clouds. Water moved below him, carrying several leaves beneath the arch. On the farther bank, a narrow path continued between hedges towards a group of small cottages. He had stood upon the bridge longer than necessary. "The stream reminded me of somewhere," Henry said. William turned his cup slowly upon its saucer. "That was why I chose Alderwick too." He had not understood it at the time. When he first came from Bristol, he had told himself that the town was convenient, quiet, and close enough to the railway for family visits. All of that was true. Yet the estate agent had shown him another cottage before the one beside the common. It had been larger, newer, and no more expensive. William had refused it. The green gate, the chestnut trees, and the sound of water beyond the common had settled the matter before he admitted that a decision had been made. Neither man had intended to return to Elmswell. They did not know what the village had become, or whether Miller's Beck still ran beneath the old wooden bridge. Turner's barn had almost certainly disappeared, and the elm might no longer stand above the bank. Instead, without speaking of it to anyone, each had chosen a town containing a small echo of the place he had lost. William had settled on one side of the common. Henry had taken a cottage beyond the bridge. For several weeks, they had lived within walking distance of each other, without knowing it. Their paths might have remained separate for years. Henry could have passed William in the market street without recognizing him. William might have repaired a book bearing Henry's name and thought nothing of it. They had become two elderly men whose faces no longer resembled the boys stored within each other's memory. Bess alone had crossed the distance between them. She had left William's green gate, passed beneath the chestnut trees, and followed the path over the stone bridge. She had found Henry seated alone upon the porch before he had properly arranged his house. Then she had returned the next morning, and the morning after that, carrying the smell of his wood fire back to William's kitchen. Henry looked down at her. Bess remained asleep between their chairs, one ear lying across William's boot. Her breathing was deep and even. She appeared unaware that anything unusual had occurred. "I thought she came for the toast," Henry said. "She may have done so at first. The ham probably helped." William smiled. Undoubtedly, yet neither believed that food entirely explained her visits. Bess had continued through the rain. She had waited patiently beside William's door and crossed the common, even when her old legs returned covered in mud. She had found something in Henry's cottage that drew her back with the same quiet certainty that had once brought her to William's green gate. The fire settled lower in the grate. Outside, drops of rain fell from the hawthorn hedge, though the sky had begun to clear above the garden. The late morning light entered through the window and rested across the unopened boxes. Their conversation became slower. The surprise of shared memories had carried them through the first hours, but there were more than 60 years between the childhood they remembered and the morning in which they now sat. Neither attempted to account for every one of them. There would be other mornings for the smaller details. William looked towards the empty cup upon the table. "My house is quite quiet," he said after a while. Henry nodded. "So is this one." William spoke of his evening meals, prepared in portions that always proved slightly too large or slightly too small, because he had not become accustomed to cooking for one. He occupied the same place at the kitchen table each night. The chair opposite remained pushed beneath the table, and Margaret's photograph stood upon the mantel. Sometimes he read until his eyes tired. Sometimes he found that he had turned several pages without following what was written. On those evenings, he spoke a few words to the photograph before lowering the lamp. Henry understood. Afternoons were the quietest time in his cottage. Morning brought tasks, coal to carry, breakfast to prepare, leaves to gather, and whatever portion of the garden his hands could manage. In the evening, he lit the fire and told himself the day was nearly complete. But the hours after midday seemed to widen. He often unfolded the newspaper again, though he had already read it over breakfast. He studied railway reports for lines upon which he no longer worked, and read announcements concerning people he did not know. When darkness came, the clock upon the mantel appeared to tick more loudly than it had during the day. Neither man used a stronger word for what they described. They spoke only of quiet rooms, single cups, one place set at a table, and the unnecessary amount of space left by an empty chair. Their voices remained calm. These things had become ordinary through repetition, and ordinary matters did not require complaint. Bess moved in her sleep and pressed more firmly against their shoes. William lowered his hand and rested it upon her head. Henry bent to smooth the fur along her back. Their hands nearly met above the old dog, and both paused. There was something gently astonishing in the simplicity of what had happened. Two boys had lost one another without quarrel. Two men had spent their working lives following separate roads. In old age, they had unknowingly sought the same kind of town, the same sound of water, and the same modest shelter near a bridge. Still, they might never have met. Bess had found Henry before William remembered his face. She had carried Henry's hearth smoke home before either man knew the other lived nearby. Morning after morning, she had crossed the common as though the distance between the cottages were a loose thread that required only patient attention. William looked across at Henry. Henry's hand remained upon Bess's greying fur. Neither man tried to explain how she had chosen. It was enough that she had. Between them, Bess slept on. The understanding that had passed between William and Henry required no further explanation. It remained quietly with them as the afternoon faded, while the fire settled lower in the grate and Bess slept with her paws stretched towards the warmth. They had found one another again after more than 50 years. Yet neither man attempted to recover those years all at once. There were too many of them, and they belonged to lives that had already been lived. What could be restored would return more naturally through ordinary mornings, small tasks, and the familiar opening of a door. When William rose to leave, Bess opened her eyes and watched him fasten his coat. For a moment, she remained beside Henry's chair, as though considering whether the journey across the common was necessary. Then she stood, stretched her old limbs, and followed William outside. Henry held the door while they stepped into the cool October air, and the dog moved along the path with the confidence of one who knew that both houses would be open to her when she returned. During the days that followed, Bess continued to travel between the two cottages. She ate breakfast in William's kitchen, followed him into the workshop, and slept beneath the bench until the room had warmed. Before noon, She often rose without warning and waited beside the green gate. William would let her through, and she would cross the common beneath the chestnut trees, pass over the stone bridge, and make her way to Henry's cottage. There she found another fire, another quiet room, and, before long, an old earthenware dish of water beneath the dresser. Henry placed a folded rug near the hearth, without mentioning why it was needed. On some evenings, Bess remained there until darkness had settled over Alderwick. On others, she returned to William with the faint smell of Henry's coal fire caught in her coat. Neither man made any formal arrangement concerning her. Bess had chosen the road for herself, and they accepted her decision. The visits between William and Henry began in much the same manner. At first, Henry came because he had walked back with Bess. He would stand at William's gate for a few minutes while they exchanged observations about the weather, the wet condition of the path, or the church clock, which had begun losing several minutes each week. Soon, he was invited into the kitchen for tea. After that, he no longer waited to be invited every time. One damp morning, Henry followed Bess through the garden and entered William's workshop for the first time. Fine rain lay against the window, softening the view of the hedge and the leaf-covered path beyond it. Inside, the small stove had begun to warm the room, and the familiar scents of leather, paper, thread and paste gathered beneath the low ceiling. The workshop was smaller than the premises William had once kept in Bristol, but its order belonged to the same life. Knives hung above the bench according to size. Rolls of cloth stood upright in a narrow cupboard. Leather remnants were tied into bundles, while the books awaiting repair rested upon a shelf away from damp and direct heat. A heavy press stood near the window, its iron handle worn smooth where William's hand had turned it over many years. Henry removed his hat and looked slowly around the room. He asked few questions, though his eyes rested upon each tool long enough for William to know that he was considering its purpose. Bess settled beneath the window while William returned to the volume on his bench, an old prayer book whose loosened pages required resewing. When Henry attempted to close the workshop door, the upper hinge shifted. The door dropped against the frame and had to be lifted before the latch would meet. William had lived with the fault since the previous winter. He raised the handle almost without noticing and guided the door into place. Henry opened it again, then closed it more carefully. The same small drop occurred. The screws no longer hold, he observed. William continued arranging the sections of the prayer book. It still opens. It only nearly closes. I repair books. Henry looked at the door, then at the row of tools above William's bench. That explains the hinge. Nothing more was said about it that morning. Henry sat beside the stove with the newspaper while William worked, and when the rain became heavier, William made tea in the kitchen. By the time Henry left, the light had faded from the window, and small pools of water had formed along the path. The following morning, he returned carrying a narrow wooden box. He removed the hinge and examined the holes where the screws had worked loose in the old timber. From a piece of seasoned wood found beneath William's bench, he cut several small plugs, fitted them into the damaged places, and trimmed them level. His hands moved with the steady economy of someone accustomed to measuring before applying weight. Each screw was tested, withdrawn, and set again until the hinge rested firmly against the frame. William watched for a time, though he pretended to be occupied with cutting a length of thread. When Henry had finished, the door moved without scraping the floor and closed with a small, exact sound. William tested it once, then opened it again. "It functions," he said. Henry returned the screwdriver to its place in the box. That is usually the purpose of a repair. There was tea in the kitchen, and the two men drank it beside the range, while Bess lay near their boots. Neither spoke about the fact that the hinge had troubled William for almost a year, or that Henry had noticed it during his first morning in the workshop. Yet each time William opened the door afterwards, he felt the ease of its movement and remembered the quiet patience with which Henry had set it right. Other small acts followed. Henry held board steady, while William cut cloth and carried coal from the shed when the wet step made William's knees uncertain. He swept leaves from the workshop path, although he claimed he did so only because Bess was bringing them indoors upon her paws. William, in turn, helped Henry with the boxes that still stood unopened in the second cottage. The books were arranged upon shelves in the sitting room. Rolled railway drawings were tied securely and stored in a dry cupboard. An old rug, which had remained folded since Henry's arrival, was carried downstairs and spread before the fire. William found a shallow wooden tray for the brass fastenings, worn tickets and keys that had gathered loosely in one of the boxes. The cottage altered slowly. It did not become crowded, nor did Henry allow much decoration, but the rooms began to show that someone intended to remain in them. A second cup was left within easy reach of the kettle. The newspaper no longer occupied the only chair beside the fire. Several railway books stood upon the shelf rather than inside a packing case. These were small changes, yet William recognized their meaning. A house began to live not when all its boxes had been opened, but when the things inside them were permitted to become useful again. Among Henry's papers lay a small notebook wrapped in an old handkerchief. He carried it to William's workshop one afternoon and placed it carefully upon the bench. Its black cloth cover had faded to grey along the edges. One corner had lifted from the board beneath it, and the spine had become loose after years of use. Several sections were pulling away from the sewing, while 2 pages near the center remained in place only because the surrounding leaves held them there. William turned the notebook beneath the window light. Its worn condition had not come from neglect. It was the wear of something carried often and kept close. The earliest pages contained measurements, gradients, and brief observations written in Henry's younger hand. Some entries had been made in brown ink, and others in pencil pressed deeply into the paper. There were sketches of retaining walls and bridge supports, distances between stations, lists of tools and notes concerning clay, rain, and unstable ground. Between those records appeared details that no official railway ledger would have preserved. Henry had written the name of a lodging house where the roof leaked above his bed, the description of a black dog that had followed a surveying party for several miles, and a reminder that a laborer named Joseph knew every verse of a song Henry had meant to learn. A pressed blade of grass rested between 2 pages. Farther back, William found several folded sheets, including an unfinished letter whose intended recipient was not named. Henry explained only that he had carried the notebook for nearly 12 years. It had travelled through rain, coal dust, railway carriages, temporary lodgings, and more than one muddy cutting. He did not wish it to be made new. He wanted only to know whether it could be prevented from falling apart. William examined the loosened sewing once more. "It can be repaired," he said. Henry rested one hand upon the bench. "Keep it as it is, if you can." William understood. The notebook did not require its history to be erased. It required enough strength to continue carrying it. He began the work the following morning. First, he lifted only the damaged portion of cloth from the spine and cleaned away the brittle adhesive beneath it. Several threads had broken, though much of the original sewing remained sound. William separated nothing that could safely be preserved. He supported the weakened sections, secured the loose pages, and fitted a narrow strip of new cloth beneath the original covering. Henry came to the workshop during the first afternoon, but did not stand over the bench. He sat near the stove with the newspaper while William worked. From time to time, the paper lowered slightly, and his gaze moved towards the notebook, but he offered no instruction. Bess slept between the stove and the window, breathing deeply while rain passed softly over the roof. The repair continued for several days. William chose cloth almost as dark as the notebook had once been, yet left most of the faded covering visible. He strengthened the damaged corner without concealing its worn edge. The water stain remained, as did the shallow hollow where Henry's thumb had rested during years of writing. William had learned long ago that restoration did not mean removing every sign of time. A book that had travelled through rain and soot should not return pretending that it had spent its life unopened upon a parlour shelf. Its worn places were not failures in the object. They were evidence that it had accompanied someone. When the paste had dried and the notebook had rested beneath a light weight, William placed it upon the bench. Henry opened it carefully. The cover moved without strain, and the repaired sections remained firm as he turned the pages. He touched the faded cloth, the darkened corner, and the stain that crossed the lower edge. William told him that he had kept those marks because they belonged to the book. A repaired thing did not need to pretend that it had never travelled or grown old. It needed only to remain strong enough for the life still before it. Henry closed the notebook and rested his palm upon the cover. For several moments he said nothing. Then he thanked William in the same quiet tone he might once have used when a bridge had been inspected and found sound. He carried the notebook home beneath his coat, although the afternoon was dry. The friendship between the two men returned in that manner, through tasks too ordinary to deserve announcement. One repaired a hinge, the other restored a notebook. A kettle was filled before the visitor arrived. A chair was moved nearer the stove. Gates were held open. Walking sticks were retrieved when they slipped against walls, and silence was allowed to remain whenever speech would have added nothing. They did not attempt to recover all the years between Elmswell and Alderwick. Those years had been lived elsewhere and among other people. William's life contained Margaret, their children, the Bristol shop, and the thousands of books that had passed beneath his hands. Henry's contained railway cuttings, station rooms, survey camps, and journeys through places William had never seen. Neither history could be fitted inside the friendship they had known as boys, and neither needed to be. Nothing that had come afterwards was displaced by their meeting again. The old friendship required only a place within the life that remained. By late October, William and Henry had begun walking together on most dry afternoons. Bess still chose the road. Sometimes she led them beside the stream beyond the stone bridge. At other times, she followed the firmer path around the common, pausing beneath the chestnut trees while damp leaves gathered against the roots. One afternoon, the sky cleared after several days of rain. Water continued to drip from the hedges, and the stream ran dark and full beneath the bridge. Bess led them along the bank until they reached a wooden bench where the path turned away from the village. William and Henry sat while the dog settled near their boots. For some time, they watched leaves moving upon the water. William thought the stream darker than Miller's Beck had been in his memory, though he knew memory often brightened distant fields and made old water run more clearly than it had. Henry wondered aloud whether the wooden bridge at Elmswell still remained. William remembered its boards silvered by weather, the nettles beside the path, and the narrow rail upon which they had once balanced when the stream was low. Beyond the bridge had stood Turner's shed, leaning slightly beneath a roof that had already begun to fail when they were boys. They had hidden bread inside that shed before setting out with 2 fishing rods. Neither of them had been permitted to borrow. The expedition had lasted most of a summer afternoon and had produced nothing except wet boots, a tangled line, and a branch that William had briefly mistaken for a fish. "Turner's shed will be gone," Henry said. "Perhaps, and the bridge may have been replaced." William watched a leaf turn slowly beneath the stone arch. Miller's Beck will still be there. The thought remained between them. Elmswell had existed for so long only in memory that neither had considered it a place to which they might return. Yet it lay somewhere beyond the hills and railway lines, changed perhaps, but not beyond reach. Henry suggested they might go in the spring. He spoke without ceremony, as though proposing another walk around the common. William considered the journey. There would be trains for much of the distance, and perhaps a hired cart from the nearest station. They need not travel quickly. By spring, the roads would be drier, the days longer, and the hedges beginning to show their first green. They made no firm arrangement. No date was chosen, and no promise was required. They spoke only of looking for the wooden bridge, following Miller's Beck, and finding the place where Turner's shed had stood. After a while, Henry said, "We should bring bread, for luncheon, for accuracy." William turned towards him and saw, behind the wire-rimmed spectacles and the lined face, something of the boy who had once concealed part of a loaf beneath his coat. "And a fishing rod?" he asked. Henry considered this. One should be sufficient. Their laughter was quiet, scarcely louder than the water beneath the bridge. Bess lifted her head, looked from one man to the other, and then rested her chin upon William's boot. The journey remained where it had been proposed. They could examine maps and railway timetables later. Spring was still several months away, and both men had lived long enough to know that a plan often rested more comfortably when it was not made too solemn. Yet when they rose from the bench and began walking back towards Alderwick, Elmswell seemed no longer entirely contained within the past. The bridge might remain or might have been replaced. Turner's shed might have fallen long ago. The elm tree beside the chapel might no longer stand. None of these possibilities altered the simple fact that William and Henry could return together and see what time had left behind. Bess moved ahead along the damp path, then stopped to wait for them. The two men followed at an unhurried pace, while the first thin sunlight of the afternoon touched the upper branches of the chestnut trees. At the stone bridge, the road divided. One path crossed the common towards William's green gate. The other continued towards Henry's cottage. Bess chose the second road, and after only a moment, William followed. Henry opened the garden gate. Inside the cottage, the repaired railway notebook lay upon the table beside the folded newspaper. Henry added coal to the fire, while William carried the kettle to the range. Beyond the window, the October light withdrew quietly from Alderwick, leaving the hedges dark and the wet road faintly silver beneath the evening sky. Nothing had been decided. Nothing needed to be hurried. But spring had been mentioned. By the time William left Henry's cottage, the last of the October light had disappeared from the common. The hedges had become dark, unbroken shapes beneath the evening sky, and the wet path reflected a little of the pale light rising behind the clouds. Henry remained at the gate until William and Bess had crossed the stone bridge. Then he lifted one hand in farewell and returned indoors, where the repaired railway notebook still rested upon the table beside his folded newspaper. Bess walked several yards ahead of William. Every so often, she paused and looked back, waiting until the soft tap of his stick had drawn nearer before continuing. She did not hurry him. The road between the two cottages was short, but age had taught both of them that a familiar journey deserved no less patience than a long one. The village had settled into evening. Curtains had been drawn across the windows of the cottages surrounding the common, and narrow bands of lamplight lay upon several garden paths. Somewhere beyond the churchyard, a gate closed. A bucket was set down in a yard. Then those small sounds faded, leaving only the stream moving beneath the bridge and the quiet rhythm of William's steps. At his green gate, Bess waited while he lifted the latch. She passed through first, followed the path to the back door, and stood beside it as though she had been away for no more than a few minutes. William entered the kitchen, removed his coat, and placed his walking stick against the wall. The room retained a little warmth from the morning fire, though the grate had darkened and the kettle stood cold upon the range. He knelt carefully to lay kindling beneath the coal. Bess circled once upon her rug before settling with a low sigh. The match flared between William's fingers, touching the paper and dry wood with a brief yellow light. Soon, a thin flame began to move beneath the grate, and the first quiet crackle of the fire returned life to the room. William filled the kettle and set it over the growing heat. He placed bread upon a plate, cut a small piece of cheese, and added water to Bess's bowl. These were the same tasks he performed most evenings, yet the silence around them no longer felt quite the same. It had not been disturbed or broken. It had simply made room for something new. When the fire had settled, William carried his tea into the sitting room. Margaret's photograph stood upon the mantel in its familiar silver frame. It had occupied that place since shortly after he moved to Alderwick, angled slightly towards the chair in which he read each evening. In the photograph, She wore the dark dress she had chosen for their daughter's wedding and the small brooch William had given her many years before. Her expression was calm, though there remained at the corners of her mouth the suggestion that she had been about to smile when the photographer uncovered the lens. William sat in the chair beside the fire. For a while, he held the cup between his hands and looked towards the photograph without speaking. During the years of their marriage, Margaret had heard nearly every story he possessed. She had known the history of the Bristol shop, the names of the customers who never paid promptly, and the reason he refused to purchase leather from one particular merchant. She had known which books he regretted selling and which repairs he still remembered with satisfaction. She had heard about Elmswell, Miller's Beck, Turner's Leaning Shed, and the fishing rods that two boys had borrowed without permission. She had also known Henry's name. William had spoken it rarely and less often as the years passed, but Margaret had remembered it. Once, when they had seen a railway bridge being widened outside Bath, she had asked whether Henry might have worked upon anything similar. William had answered that he did not know. At another time, while sorting old letters, she had found one bearing an Elmswell postmark and wondered aloud whether he had ever attempted to find his boyhood friend. He had told her that too much time had passed. Margaret had not argued. She had merely folded the letter again and returned it to the box. Now William watched the first firelight gather upon the edge of the silver frame. "I found Henry," he said. The words sounded both simpler and stranger when spoken aloud. Bess raised her head from the rug beside his chair. She listened for a moment, then lowered it again. William told Margaret that Henry had come to live in the cottage across the common. He explained that neither of them had recognized the other immediately, and that Bess had begun visiting Henry before William understood who he was. He spoke of the railway notebook, its loosened spine and its pages filled with gradients, stations, muddy cuttings, and small details preserved from a younger life. He told her about the hinge Henry had repaired and the way the workshop door now closed without needing to be lifted. He did not recount every word exchanged between them. There had been few enough, and most had belonged to the quiet of the afternoons in which they were spoken. Instead, he described the things Margaret would have understood: the second cup near Henry's kettle, the chair moved closer to the stove, the repaired notebook carried home beneath a coat on a dry day. At last, he told her about Elmswell. "Henry thinks we might return in the spring," he said, "to see whether the bridge remains." He paused, looking towards the photograph. "We shall bring bread." The faintest smile passed over his face. Margaret could not answer, yet William did not feel that he had spoken into an empty room. Her absence remained what it had always been: quiet, complete, and beyond repair. But the life they had shared had not disappeared with her. It continued in the habits she had known, in the stories she had remembered, and in the manner in which William still turned towards her when something mattered. For years, he had believed that speaking of a new event in front of her photograph might sharpen the fact that she had not been present to witness it. That evening, it did something gentler. It allowed Henry's return to enter the long history William and Margaret had built together. The old friendship did not stand apart from his marriage or compete with the years that followed Elmswell. It simply took its place among them. The kettle shifted softly upon the range in the adjoining room. The fire gave a small sigh as a piece of coal settled. William finished his tea. Before rising, he reached towards the mantel and adjusted Margaret's photograph by the smallest degree, turning it a little farther towards the room. "You would have liked him," he said. Then he reconsidered. "You did like him, I think, from the stories." Bess opened her eyes as William stood. Together they returned to the kitchen, where he prepared the fire for the night and checked that the back door was fastened. He placed his cup beside the sink, folded his spectacles, and left them upon the table. Before extinguishing the lamp, he looked once through the dark window towards the common. Henry's cottage could not be seen clearly beyond the chestnut trees, but a small light showed between the branches. For the first time since arriving in Alderwick, William knew who sat beside that distant fire. Across the common, Henry had not yet gone to bed. After William left, he had remained in his sitting room with the railway notebook before him. He opened it once, turned several pages, and stopped at a list of distances written more than 50 years earlier. The figures belonged to another county and another railway, yet the familiar columns of place names and miles returned his thoughts to the wooden bench beside the stream. Elmswell. He had not written the name for many years. Henry closed the notebook and carried it to the shelf. The repair allowed the spine to move easily, but he still handled it with the care due to something that had travelled far enough. He placed it between two larger railway volumes, where it stood upright without strain. Then he crossed to the cupboard, in which William had helped him arrange his rolled drawings and old papers. At the back lay a folded railway map. The paper had softened along its creases, and several lines were no longer current. Some stations had closed, junctions had changed, and smaller companies had long ago become part of larger ones. It was not a map Henry would have trusted for a working journey, yet the rivers, towns, and older routes remained clear enough to show him where to begin. He carried it to the table and moved the lamp nearer. The map opened across most of the surface, covering the place where his newspaper usually lay. Henry placed the sugar bowl upon one corner and the empty teacup upon another to prevent the paper from folding itself closed. Then he adjusted his spectacles and followed the lines westward with one finger. Finding Elmswell required time. The village was too small to be printed prominently, and the nearest station was marked in letters scarcely larger than the lines crossing beneath them. Henry traced one route, rejected it, and began again from the junction nearest Alderwick. A second possibility required fewer changes, but would leave them farther from the village. A third followed a longer curve and appeared likely to provide the easiest connection. He wrote the station names upon a clean sheet of paper. The first line was careful and practical. Beneath it, he noted the possible changes, the distance from the last station to Elmswell, and the need to inquire about a hired cart. He left the times blank. The spring timetable had not yet been issued, and there was no reason to settle the details in October. At the top of the page, he wrote, Elmswell. Spring Henry rested the pencil beside the paper. For much of his life, maps had represented work still to be done. They had shown where a line might cross a valley, where land rose too sharply, or where a bridge would be required. Each mark led towards a problem to be measured, calculated, and made passable. The lines before him required none of that. The railway already existed. The journey needed no survey. He and William had only to follow what had been built while their lives were unfolding elsewhere. His eyes returned to the small printed place near the edge of the map. Elmswell had once seemed too far behind them to be reached by any road. It belonged to summer afternoons, wet boots, and the untested certainty that friendship would continue simply because neither boy could imagine its ending. Henry had carried the memory through stations, rented rooms and railway camps, but he had not expected to stand beside Miller's Beck again. Now the journey could be written as a short sequence of ordinary names, one station, then another, a final road into the village. Henry folded the paper once and placed it inside the front cover of a current railway guide. The guide remained upon the table where he could reach it when the new timetable arrived. He folded the old map carefully along its existing creases and returned it to the cupboard. Nothing had been booked. No date had been chosen. William had not yet agreed to a particular route, and spring remained beyond the winter months still to come. But the way to Elmswell was no longer only a memory. It had become a journey for which a map could be consulted. Henry extinguished the lamp and stood for a moment in the darkened sitting room. Beyond the window, a light shone faintly from William's cottage across the common. It remained visible until Henry drew the curtain. In the weeks that followed, the people of Alderwick grew accustomed to seeing the two old men together. At first, their meetings were noticed only by those whose windows looked upon the common. Mrs. Talbot, while shaking crumbs from a cloth behind her cottage, saw William and Henry beneath the chestnut trees, with Bess walking between them. The postman encountered them near the stone bridge and moved aside to let the three pass along the narrow path. Children returning from the village school saw Bess waiting while the men rested upon the bench beside the stream. No one asked for an explanation. Alderwick was a village in which changes were observed long before they were discussed, and this particular change seemed to require no discussion at all. William had once crossed the common alone, usually with Bess a short distance ahead. Henry, during his first weeks in the second cottage, had walked the same paths at different hours, pausing to examine the bridge or follow the line of the stream. Now their separate habits had joined. On clear mornings, Henry came through William's green gate, while smoke was still rising from the workshop chimney. On damp afternoons, William crossed to Henry's cottage with a book beneath his arm. Sometimes they walked before tea. Sometimes they merely stood at the bridge and watched rainwater passing beneath the arch. Bess continued to choose the direction. She led them beneath the chestnut trees, along the stream and around the outer edge of the common where the grass remained firm. If William stopped, she stopped. If Henry fell several steps behind, she turned and waited until he had caught up. She did not appear to prefer one man's company to the other. Her concern was only that neither should be left too far behind. Their pace suited the village. It was slow enough for greetings at gates, for remarks about the weather, and for pauses wherever fallen leaves had made the path uncertain. The two men spoke when they wished, and allowed silence to accompany them when they did not. From a distance, their quietness appeared companionable rather than empty. One afternoon, the clouds lifted shortly before dusk. The common remained wet from an earlier shower, and the chestnut trunks were almost black against the pale sky. William and Henry emerged from the path near the stream, while Bess moved several yards ahead. At the center of the common, the dog stopped. The road divided there, one way leading towards William's cottage, and the other curving past the bridge towards Henry's. For a time, Bess looked along both paths. Then she turned away from them and followed the narrow strip of grass between the cottages. William and Henry followed. From nearby windows, the people of Alderwick saw the three figures crossing the common together, the old dog in front, William with his walking stick, and Henry beside him, matching his pace without appearing to do so. Perhaps Bess remembered nothing of Elmswell, the wooden bridge, or the two boys who had once hidden bread in Turner's shed. Those memories belonged to the men behind her, yet she had found the road between their houses before either of them understood why she travelled it, and she continued to lead them over it now. She had not returned them to the lives they had possessed as boys. No road could do that. Margaret remained part of William's quiet rooms. The railway years remained written into Henry's notebook. The lost decade stood between Elmswell and Alderwick, filled with work, families, journeys and changes that could neither be removed nor relived. But the old road had not vanished. It had only waited for them to approach it from another direction. At the far side of the common, Bess paused beneath the chestnut trees. The last leaves moved softly above her, and the damp grass held the fading light. William and Henry drew nearer, their footsteps unhurried and almost even. Then Bess continued, towards the bridge, towards spring, towards home, and as Bess continued across the common, William and Henry followed her at the same gentle pace, neither hurrying to reach the bridge, nor looking back towards the road they had already travelled. The last light faded from the chestnut trees. One by one, the windows of Alderwick grew dark, until only a few small lamps remained behind drawn curtains. Beneath the stone bridge, the stream continued through the night, carrying fallen leaves beyond the village and into fields no one could see. Soon, William would return to the cottage with the green gate. He would hang his coat beside the kitchen door, place his walking stick against the wall, and add one final piece of coal to the fire. Henry would continue along the other path, towards the quiet room where his repaired notebook rested safely upon the shelf and a folded railway map waited inside the cupboard. Bess would choose where she wished to sleep. Perhaps she would settle beside William's stove, her old paws stretched towards the warmth. Perhaps she would remain upon the rug near Henry's chair, listening to the soft turning of a newspaper page. It did not matter which house she chose. The road between them would still be there in the morning, and beyond the rain-darkened hills, Elmswell waited without impatience. The wooden bridge might remain. Miller's Beck would continue beneath whatever trees had grown along its banks. Spring would arrive when it was ready, bringing softer earth, lengthening evenings, and the first pale green upon the hedges. There would be time enough then for maps and railway timetables, for a loaf wrapped carefully in paper, and perhaps even one unnecessary fishing rod. But none of that needed to be decided tonight. Tonight, the gates were closed, the fires were low, and every road had grown quiet beneath the autumn darkness. You may leave William and Henry there, walking slowly behind Bess, while the common opens peacefully before them. They know the way home now. There is no need to follow them any farther. Let their footsteps grow softer. Let the stream carry the story away. Let the village fade beyond the darkness of the room. Nothing more is required of you tonight. The day has finished. The unanswered things can remain unanswered, and morning will come without being summoned. Your breathing may deepen in its own time. Your thoughts may become quieter, and sleep may find you as gently as an old road rediscovered beneath familiar trees. No distance left to travel, no promise left to keep, only rest.